All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight we're going to read another sutta. We are still making our way through the middle-length discourses. We're moving on to sutta number 88 this evening. This is going to be the Bāhitika Sutta, the the imported piece of cloth is what a Bāhitika is. Um, in the wisdom publication, they have it as the cloak. It's not actually quite a cloak yet, though. It's just a big piece of cloth, but it comes from a foreign country. That's what a Bāhitika seems to be. Um, a quick reminder that we're in this section of the Majjhima Nikāya, where we are imported, brought in from a different region. In this case, a different region of India. But we'll get to that at the end of the sutta. Quick reminder, the little section that we're in, this is the Rajavaga. This is the little group of 10 suttas that all have to deal with kings, with rajas. And actually, what we're looking at tonight is sort of the continuation of last week's sutra, and in a way, even a sutra before that. And what I mean is that the king, that is the king of this sutta tonight, the king is Prasanajit or Pasanadi. And that was the king from last time. And if you were here, you'll remember that it was the king's, the queen, Malika, the king's wife, who had some questions about the Dharma, and so sent a messenger to go, a Brahmin messenger to go learn from the Buddha. The messenger brought back the message to the queen, and the queen kind of taught the message or taught the lesson to the king, and in a way brought the king closer to kind of basically being a Buddhist in that way. I think we're to understand that we're sort of witnessing King Prasanadi's conversion. You'll remember a few suttas ago, it was the Angulimala Sutta, and that was the one of the murderer who had the necklace of fingers, right? And you might recall that King Prasanajit, King Prasanadi, he went to the Buddha to get Angulimala to bring him back to basically, have him capitally punished in that way. But then the Buddha showed King Prasanajit, no, I've tamed him. And if you remember that sutta, it was important because the king was very impressed with the Buddha converting this murderous person, but converting him without any violence or any force. And the king was like, whoa, that's pretty impressive. Then we get last week's sutta where the queen kind of brings the king a little bit closer. And now tonight we have another one with King Prasanajit. Second. Yeah, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's see what the deal is. By the way, I'll let you know right away, this is an interesting one tonight because it's one of those sutras where it's not the Buddha. Tonight, it's one of the suttas where Ananda gives the teaching. And as I'm always saying in Dharma Doors, we always want to be very aware of who is speaking to who. And we always want to be really clear when things are being said by the Buddha versus when things are being said by other people. And I say this because it's been my experience, well, actually, a lot like last week's sutta. It was very interesting to see the way that Queen Malika sort of changed the Dharma a little bit and presented it in just such a way to her husband, the king. And so it was important to notice that that was the queen talking to the king in that way. So it'll be important to remember that tonight, or the Dharma, it's being taught by Ananda. So But let's find out what's going on with Ananda. So again, this is Sutta 88, the Bāhitika Sutta, the imported cloth. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then, when it was morning, the Venerable Ananda, dressed and taking his bowl and outer robe, he went into Savatthi to beg for food, to beg for alms. When he had wandered for alms in Savatthi and had returned from his alms round, after his meal he went to the eastern park, so to the other side of Savatthi, to the palace of Migara's mother, for the day's abiding, for his day's meditation. Now, we are told on that occasion, King Pasenadi of Kosala had mounted the elephant Ekapundarika. The single lotus flower was the elephant's name. And the king was riding out of Savatthi at midday. He saw the Venerable Ananda coming in the distance, and he asked the minister Sirivadaha, "That is the Venerable Ananda, is it not?" "Yes, sire, that's the Venerable Ananda." Then King Pasenadi of Kosala told somebody, "Come, good man, go to the Venerable Ananda and pay homage in my name with your head at his feet, saying, 'Venerable Sir, King Pasenadi of Kosala pays homage with his head at the Venerable One's feet.' Then say this, 'Venerable Sir, if the Venerable Ananda has no urgent business, if you have nowhere better to be, perhaps the Venerable Ananda would wait a moment out of compassion.'" "Yes, sire," the man replied, and he went to the Venerable Ananda, and after paying homage to him, he stood to one side and said to the Venerable Ananda, "Venerable sire, King Pasenadi of Kosala pays homage with his head at the Venerable Ananda's feet, and he says this, 'Venerable sir, if the Venerable Ananda has no urgent business, perhaps the Venerable Ananda would wait a moment out of compassion.'" The Venerable Ananda consented in silence. Then King Pasenadi went by elephant as far as the elephant could go, and then he dismounted and he went to the Venerable Ananda by foot. After paying homage to him, he stood at one side and he said to the Venerable Ananda, "If, Venerable Sir, the Venerable Ananda has no urgent business, it would be good if he would go to the bank of the river Achirivata out of compassion." The Venerable Ananda again consented in silence, and he went to the bank of the river Achirivata and sat down at the root of a tree on a seat made ready. Then King Pasenadi went by elephant as far as the elephant could go, and then he dismounted and went to the Venerable Ananda on foot. After paying homage to him, he stood at one side and said to the Venerable Ananda, "Here, Venerable, here is an elephant rug. Let the Venerable Ananda be seated upon it." But Ananda replied, "There is no need, great king. Sit down. I'm already sitting on my own mat." King Pasenadi of Kosala sat down on a seat made ready and said, "Venerable Ananda, would the Buddha, the Blessed One, the Bhagavan, would the Bhagavan behave with the body in such a way that he could be censured or reprimanded by recluses and Brahmins?" All right, so that's the beginning. I want to just set up a few things, a couple of language things that I want to mention real quick. Actually, really quickly, I've been meaning to mention something for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and I keep not doing it. So let me use this pause. I want to mention it really quickly. It's just something that you may find interesting, you might not. if you've been coming to Dharma doors, you might have noticed this kind of the repetition of this little thing. And what it is, it's this thing about that when people go to see the Buddha, or especially when these kings go to see the Buddha, right? They have their like their chariots, their wagons and their carts, or their elephants or their horses, and they take those chariots and carts and things only so far before they have to get off and go by foot. This happens a lot in these sutras where these royalty, they eventually need to give up their chariots or what have you and go by foot. And I actually always find that a very like interesting part of the story. And it always kind of makes me think of like if I were doing like a modern, redo of a sutra, the Buddha would be living way out where nobody gets a cell phone service. And the idea would be that you would get only so far and the GPS would stop at a certain point, and then you'd have to go off grid, right? And in order to go see the Buddha. So I just think that that's a really kind of interesting comment, like a commentary on where the Buddha's at versus kind of where everybody else is coming from in that way. You have to go by foot to see the Buddha. And I just think that that's interesting. So again, it's come up so many times. I've been wanting to mention it. But let's get to Ananda's question. So, or the king's question to Ananda, I should say. So the king has this question, and the question is, Venerable Ananda, would the Blessed One, would the Buddha behave in a way with his body in such a way that recluses and Brahmins could censure him? And I want to mention something really quickly, but I'm not going to go too into depth about it. There is, in the commentary tradition, there is a kind of a backstory to this sutra. And I'm not going to give you the whole backstory because I agree with Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, which is that this sutra doesn't actually mention this backstory. So I'm not entirely convinced that it's important. So without going into a lot of details, the backstory seems to be that there were some like jealous rival, teachers who basically tried to set the Buddha up. And so basically started spreading rumors. And there's like a whole backstory to these rumors that the Buddha was behaving badly. Supposedly, that's what prompted the king to go see the Buddha. And this question of like, hey, Ananda, would the Buddha ever behave in a way with his body that like other Brahmins and, sagely people or other recluses, would he behave in a way that they would censure him or reprimand him, right? Or, um, accuse the Buddha in that way. So we can read this as if the king has come in concern about this backstory, or we could just read it that the king is interested in what is Buddhism all about, and he's gone to see the Buddha, or gone to see Ananda, I should say, to ask some questions because he's curious. We could read it either way, I would think. So there's only one line a little bit later on that maybe sort of is referring to this backstory, but we'll see. Oh, and also, by the way, just in case you don't know, to prepare you, what we're about to get into, this whole sutra, the whole teaching, going to be a teaching about karma. But of course, in the world of Buddhism, when we talk about karma, all we're talking about is action, activity, movement, basically, karma, right? And this sutra is going to be talking about body karma, vocal karma, and mental karma. And before we kind of even get into this, I kind of just want to like mention a couple of things for you to be thinking about, to have in the background. Even if you know, like you've heard a lot about body, speech, mind karma, even if you've heard a lot about it, just bear with me because you might find a little bit of this interesting. So, not just in, of course, the Buddhist tradition, but kind of all throughout traditional classic Indian philosophy, there's a generally accepted understanding of what it would be called karma, but it's nothing magical, it's nothing mysterious, it's nothing about, whatever. It just means activity. But what I think is really interesting about the division of karmic activity in traditional Indian thinking is this division of there being like bodily karma, physical bodily karma, vocal karma, and mental karma, like thinking versus talking versus doing. Now, the thing that I think is so interesting about that threefold division is this. So, over on this side is the body. The you could call it the physical, you could call it the gross, but by which I do not mean icky, right, or weird. I mean not subtle, just sort of obvious. So there's the body, the gross, and then there's the mind. The mind is subtle. The mind, the mind is intangible. The mind is not physical at all. The body's physical. Mental activity or mental karma, you can't take mental karma and like see it exactly. You can't smell it. It's very subtle that way. So the mind or the world of mental karma is again very subtle, and the world of physical karma or the body is very gross in that way. What I think is so interesting is looking at vocal karma, the voice, as such a very interesting bridge between the physical and the mental. And what I mean by that is that vocal karma or just the voice, it's kind of weird because if you think about a word, a word, well, one part of that is just the sound, that meaning like word, just the actual phonetic word, 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 right? Just the sound. And that is very physical, very gross. It's very, you could, you measure it with an instrument. But then there's what the word means. There's like what it indicates, and that's the realm of the mind, right? Because it's the mind that hears a sound like word and can turn that sound into meaning and significance. And so the voice is a very interesting bridge. And you know what else is interesting about it? It goes for the written text as well, because all of these black marks on the white paper, they have a physical dimension, which is just their, you know, what they look like. But then there's that mental dimension, which looks at these letters and unpacks what they mean. So whether we're talking about text or vocal words, language itself is very weird for having sort of one foot in the physical dimension and one foot in the mental dimension. I say this Because when you're kind of studying karma or you're thinking about karma, there's a classic kind of, it's not even a Buddhist saying. It's just sort of one of those like pan-Indian sayings. And what it is they talk about how what you think is what you talk about, and the things you talk about are the things that you do. In other words, our reality, it sort of bubbles up in terms of like we think about things like maybe I should move, like, get a new house and move, but it starts with a thought. And then we start talking to our friends. Should I move? Do you think I should move? I've been thinking about moving lately. And then pretty soon you're driving a moving truck and you're physically moving. But it all started with a thought that turned into talking, that turned into doing. So there's always this sort of interesting way of looking at the way that these three sources of karma interrelate in that way, that they sort of influence each other in that sense. And then also that really interesting way where the body or the physical and the mental are sort of in two different realms, and the voice is an interesting bridge between them. So just a couple of interesting seeds, so to speak, to plant before we dive deep into this sutta. Any questions about karma in general? Before we, yeah, I know all of you know all that already. Okay, so the king wants to know, would the Buddha ever do anything with his body that was bad? Basically what he's saying, right? And Ananda replies, Great King, Maharaja, the Blessed One, the Buddha, would not behave with the body in such a way that he could be censured by wise recluses and Brahmins. Would the Blessed One, Venerable Ananda, behave with his voice, with speech, in such a way that he could be censured by wise recluses and Brahmins? Or by recluses and Brahmins? Maharaja, the Blessed One would not behave with speech in such a way that he could be censured by wise recluses and Brahmins. Would the Blessed One, Venerable Ananda, behave with the mind in such a way that he could be censured and be censured by recluses and Brahmins? Great King, the Blessed One would not behave with the mind in such a way that he could be censured by wise recluses and Brahmins. And the king replies, Oh, it's wonderful, Venerable Sir. It's marvelous. For what we were unable to accomplish with a question has been accomplished by the Venerable Ananda with the answer to the question. We don't recognize anything of value in the praise and blame of others spoken by foolish, ignorant people who speak without having investigated and evaluated. But we recognize as valuable the praise or blame of others spoken by wise, intelligent, and sagacious people who speak only after having investigated and evaluated. So that little part there is the one part that seems to be referring to this group of Brahmins that were accusing the Buddha of doing something, but without having investigated it, without having looked into it. They were just spreading these rumors in that way. And so just, yeah, really quickly, if you read the Pali version of this or whatever, the king and the translation here reflects it. The king says, would the Buddha ever behave in such a way with his body that he could be censured by recluses and Brahmins? And Ananda replies, oh yeah, no, the Buddha would never behave in such a way with the body that he could be censured by wise recluses and Brahmins. Or the actual word, I think it's a it's a version of the word vijnana, or consciousness, but I actually wouldn't, based on my research, I wouldn't translate it as wise so much as sensible. And it's that idea of like, well, Ananda's basically saying a sensible person would never accuse the Buddha of bad behavior. Some non-sensible, kind of ignorant person who hasn't investigated, yeah, they might accuse the Buddha of something. They might censure the Buddha. So when the king is like, oh, it's wonderful, the Venerable Ananda answers what I couldn't ask. It's a reference to the fact that Ananda added that extra word and saying like, yeah, I know other people are talking bad about the Buddha, but anybody who has any sense, they wouldn't do that. All right. So that's the first part. And the king is satisfied with Ananda's answer in that way. But now he has another question. And he says, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior is censured by wise or sensible recluses and Brahmins? So now the king wants to know, okay, then what would be bad behavior? What is censured by wise, sensible people or recluses and Brahmins? And Ananda replies, oh, king, any bodily behavior that is akushala or akusala, great king, any bodily behavior that is unskillful, they're going to translate it here as unwholesome, and other translations might translate this word akusala or akusala as bad, right? As like unwholesome or bad behavior. So what kind of bodily behavior is censured by the wise? Any bodily behavior that is akusala or unskillful. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk, this is a really important word in the world of Buddhism. This idea of akusala or kusala, unskillful or skillful. I was excited to teach this sutra tonight because even though it's one of these like a morality sutra in that way, like not a deep philosophical one in that sense, but just morality. I was excited to teach this though, because Buddhist morality is so interesting. And it has to do with this particular word. So what people usually call good behavior and bad behavior, or again, it might even be evil behavior and good behavior, or again, wholesome and unwholesome. I'm here to tell you, akusala and kusala, it would be well translated as skillful and unskillful. And in particular, the definition of unskillful, of akusala, what it is it's behavior that you think is going to lead to a particular end, a particular result, and it actually results in the exact opposite of that. That's unskillful. You completely missed the mark. In fact, you went the complete other direction. So there's a lot of course, examples of what constitutes unskillful or akusala behavior. It's basically, of course, yeah, all of the morality in that way. Not killing, not stealing, not lying, not uh, abusing sexuality in that way, not abusing intoxicants in that way. So all of those things are considered to be akusala or unskillful. But what they're talking about is this idea of, like, for example, I use this one a lot from personal experience, but it's this idea that drinking in excess to the point of vomiting and things like that, right? Getting drunk to the point of inebriation and vomiting. The idea that that is a good time, the idea that that is having a good time, that's considered unskillful. And it's unskillful because if you really take a step back, it's not a good time. That's very confused. I was confused that way for a while in thinking that that was like, woohoo, I'm having a good time. There's so many examples of this in the world of Buddhism. Another great example is the idea of thinking that acquiring property will make you happy. And then all of a sudden you have to deal with all of this stuff and it becomes a burden. And it's the complete opposite direction that you were going for. All of this stuff was supposed to be making me happy. And now I have to deal with it. What I like to think about is the example of unskillful that I often think of. I always think of these little finger trap things. You might have played with these when you were a kid, the little bamboo paper finger trap. And you put your fingers in the little paper trap and you try to pull your fingers out. But ironically, the harder you pull, the tighter the little finger trap gets and the harder it is to get out. Well, what you do is you try to pull even harder then, because that's like the instinct is like you are trapped. So I'll pull harder, but that just makes the trap tighter. That's unskillful. You're trying to get out, but you just keep doubling down on what's not working. What I love about the finger trap analogy, by the way, is that in order to get out, you have to relax and move in. And I think that that's a very appropriate kind of analogy for the idea of Buddhism, of relaxing and moving in. So, so that's my definition of unskillful or akusala dharma in that way. This idea of hey, Ananda, what bodily behavior would the Buddha or would wise people censure or reprimand? And Ananda says, oh, any bodily behavior that's unskillful, that's akusala. Now, of course, if you're like the king, you want to know more about that. So the king asks, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior is unskillful, is unwholesome, is akusala? Oh, any bodily behavior that is blameworthy, great king. So any behavior that other people would point the finger at and go, shouldn't be doing that. So that's savajja, blameworthy. But of course, the king wants to know, hey, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior is blameworthy? Ananda replied, any bodily behavior that brings affliction, great king, or trouble, harm, is this idea of sababajja, this idea of that brings affliction or brings harm or trouble. So that's the kind of bodily behavior that's blameworthy. Any bodily behavior that brings affliction, great king. Well, now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of bodily behavior brings affliction or trouble or harm? Oh, any bodily behavior that has dukkha vipaka, that has painful or dukkha results. Those kind, great king. Now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior has dukkha vipaka, has dukkha results? Oh, any bodily behavior, great king, that leads to one's own harm, that leads to the harm of others, that leads to the harm or affliction of both self and others, and behavior that on account of which unwholesome, unskillful states increase and get more, and skillful, wholesome states diminish. Oh, yeah, such bodily behavior is censured by wise recluses and Brahmins, great king. We're going to do verbal and mental, but is everybody okay with that kind of daisy chain of definitions there? Everybody's okay with that idea of moving from unskillful behavior? What is unskillful? Well, it's what is blameworthy, what's blameworthy, whatever brings affliction, what brings affliction, whatever has dukkha results, what has dukkha results. Any bodily behavior that brings harm to oneself, brings harms to others, harm to oneself and others, and that behavior that increases unskillfulness and behavior that decreases skillfulness. That's bodily behavior that is akusala or unwholesome. Any questions about definitions of any of those or what any of that would mean? Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior is censured by wise recluses and Brahmins? Oh, any verbal behavior that is unskillful, great king, that is akusala. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior is unskillful or unwholesome? Any verbal behavior that is blameworthy, great king. Now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior is blameworthy? Oh, any verbal behavior that brings affliction, great king. Now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior brings affliction? Any verbal behavior that has painful dukkha results. Those kind, great king. Oh, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior has dukkha vipaka, has painful dukkha results? Any verbal behavior that leads to one's own harm or affliction, or the harm and affliction of others, or the harm and affliction of both self and others, and on account of which unwholesome states increase and wholesome states decrease. Such verbal behavior is censured by wise recluses and Brahmins, great king. Now, Ananda, what kind of mental behavior is censured by wise recluses and Brahmins? Any mental behavior that is unskillful, great king. Well, now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of mental behavior is unskillful? Oh, any mental behavior that is blameworthy, great king. Now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of mental behavior is blameworthy? Any mental behavior that brings affliction. That kind, great king. Oh, now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of mental behavior brings affliction? Any mental behavior that has dukkha vipaka, that has painful dukkha results. Now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of mental behavior has dukkha vipaka, has dukkha results? Any mental behavior, great king, that leads to one's own harm or affliction, that leads to the harm or affliction of others, that leads to the harm and affliction of both self and others, and on account of which unwholesome states increase and wholesome states decrease. Such mental behavior is censured by wise recluses and Brahmins, great king. Now the king wants to know this. He says, now, Venerable Ananda, does the Blessed One only praise getting rid of unwholesome states? Like, is he only about getting rid of all that bad stuff? And Ananda replied, the Tathagata, the thus come one, oh, the thus come one, great king, has abandoned all unwholesome states, and he possesses wholesome states. And the king wants to know, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior is uncensured by wise recluses and Brahmins? So what kind of bodily behavior is okay, is permissible, is allowed, is approved by wise people? So now we're doing kusala in that way, or, what is permissible? And Ananda replies, any bodily behavior that is kusala, great king, that is skillful. Any behavior that leads to the goal that you're trying to accomplish in that way. Anything that's skillful. Now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior is skillful or wholesome? Oh, any bodily behavior that is blameless, great king. Behavior that others would not throw blame at you for. Well, but now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of bodily behavior is blameless? Any bodily behavior that does not bring affliction, great king. But Venerable Nanda, what kind of bodily behavior does not bring affliction? Any bodily behavior that has sukha vipaka, that has pleasurable, blissful results. That's the kind of bodily behavior that's not censured. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of bodily behavior has sukha vipaka? What can you do with the body that has pleasurable, blissful results? And Ananda replies, any bodily behavior, great king, that does not lead to one's own harm and affliction, or to the harm and affliction of others, or to the harm and affliction of both self and others, and its bodily action that on account of which unwholesome, unskillful states get less, they diminish, and wholesome, skillful states increase. Such bodily behavior, great king, is uncensured by wise recluses and Brahmins. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior is uncensured by wise recluses and Brahmins? Any verbal behavior, great king, that is skillful, that's wholesome. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior is skillful or wholesome? Well, any verbal behavior that is blameless, great king. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior is blameless? Any verbal behavior that does not bring affliction, great king. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior doesn't bring affliction? Any verbal behavior that has sukha vipaka, pleasant results, great king. Oh, well, Venerable Ananda, what kind of verbal behavior has pleasant results? Any verbal behavior, great king, that does not lead to one's own harm and affliction, or to the harm and affliction of others, or to the harm and affliction of both self and others, and it's verbal behavior on account of which unwholesome states diminish and wholesome states increase. Such verbal behavior, great king, is uncensured by wise recluses and Brahmins. Now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of mental behavior is uncensured by the wise recluses and Brahmins? Oh, any mental behavior that is skillful or wholesome, great king. Now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of mental behavior is skillful or wholesome? Any mental behavior that is blameless, great king. Now, Venerable Nanda, what kind of mental behavior is blameless? Any mental behavior that does not bring trouble and affliction, great king. Well, now, Venerable Ananda, what kind of mental behavior doesn't bring trouble and affliction? Any mental behavior that has pleasant results, great king. Well, Venerable Ananda, what kind of mental behavior has pleasant results? Any mental behavior, great king, that does not lead to one's own harm and affliction, or to the harm and affliction of others, or to the harm and affliction of both self and others. And it's mental behavior that, on account of which, unwholesome states diminish and wholesome states increase. Such mental behavior, great king, is uncensured by wise recluses and Brahmins. And now the king wants to know, well, now, Venerable Ananda, does the Blessed One praise only the undertaking of all such wholesome states? And Ananda replies, the Tathagata, great king, has abandoned all unwholesome states and possesses wholesome states. All right, let's pause there. Just want to mention that last part. And it happened before where Ananda said, oh, the Buddha, the Blessed One, he's abandoned all unwholesome states. So we want to kind of acknowledge, or I think that we need to acknowledge that the king's question is like, so you guys, you Buddhist guys, you're all working on like getting rid of those unwholesome behaviors, right? And Ananda replies regarding the Buddha, he's like, oh, the Buddha? Now he's gotten rid of them all. He's not working on it. He did it. And that's why we follow him. Like, that's why he's the Buddha. So I just kind of want to put a big, kind of that exclamation point on that idea that when Ananda says, oh, the Blessed One, he's abandoned unwholesome states. So he doesn't do unwholesome anymore in that way. And then this idea that, oh, and then regarding the wholesome, yeah, he's all about it. That's that's his deal. So, okay. So that's sort of actually the little Dharma lesson in that way. That's pretty much it. It's a teaching on wholesome, unwholesome dharmas. It's a teaching on the three sources of karma. A little bit like we talked about last week, the sutra, if you notice, kind of midway through, it kind of moves into a meditative mode, right? Where it's just kind of repeating these ideas and repeating these refrains. And I think that the idea is that you're supposed to spend that time reflecting on the wholesome and the unwholesome and reflecting on the difference between bodily behavior, vocal behavior, mental behavior. And I think the idea of this, of a sutra like this, if I may add a little like interpretation, I think that at the beginning, when King Pasenadi, when he says, um, it was the thing where he says like, yeah, I don't really listen to foolish people that don't investigate what they're talking about, right? But I only kind of listen to those people who have investigated and evaluated what they're talking about. My interpretation of this sutra is that in what I just read and in what we just walked through, we investigated wholesome and unwholesome mental, vocal, and physical karma. Like, and what I kind of mean is, I think it's sort of like important to not just think of like, um, to not just think in general terms of like, I'm going to try to be good as like a general idea of good. I think it's actually important to actually like think about the body and when it's moving through the section on the body and it's talking about bodily behavior that is skillful, bodily behavior that's not blameworthy, bodily behavior that leads to pleasant or unpleasant results. I think, we're really at that moment to be thinking about how we use the body and thinking about what does it mean for to do something with my body that has dukkha vipaka, that has dukkha results, versus doing something with my body that has blissful results. And what I'm getting at is that thinking about that, the body, that's different than the voice. Like when we move to the voice and it's like, oh, okay, now how do I use my voice in a way that might have afflictive results? Right? Like am I using my voice harshly? Am I using it critically? Like, am I causing affliction with my voice? And we want to notice that that's different activity than the way that we might use our body. And then the third, the mental, if we've really been doing this kind of investigation where we're following the sutra, when it's talking about the body, we're with the body. When it's talking about the unskillful, we're thinking about unskillful, we're thinking about skillful, and then we're thinking about our voice. If we've been doing that, we're ready to start thinking about our mind at that point because we are already sort of getting into a meditative mode. And then thinking about the way we use our mind, it's very subtle to think about, am I using my mind in a way that's afflictive? Because I'm worrying about things all the time. And that's like causing me a lot of affliction and in a way harm. I should probably be thinking about that. But I I wouldn't have probably come to that thought of, am I thinking in a way that's causing me affliction? I might not have come to such a subtle thought if I was just thinking about being good, like as a general idea, and not dividing my body from the voice, from the mind, and not thinking about it in terms of skillful and unskillful and blameworthy and blameless and blissful results and dukkha results. So I just want to point at how the sutra works, like that as a meditation, it's an invitation to investigate and explore. So any questions about that? We still have a little bit to go. We sort of have the beautiful conclusion of the story, or there's like kind of a story. Yeah, Maria.
It's more of a comment. I just wanted to mention that I kind of love one thing I really kind of love about the morality sutras is that there's, especially when we're using sort of vague terms like wholesome and unwholesome, that there's like this underlying sort of implication that you know what I mean. Like somewhere inside each and every one of us, we know better. Like when we were drinking to drunkenness, or at least I can speak for myself, somewhere in there, I knew better. And that's sort of what led me out of it, likely. Um, but then I think it implies this like, oh, so if we intentionally want to know better, there's sort of this path that allows us to get to a place where we know better all the time. And I've used the phrase, if we knew better, we would have done better. And if, so kind of that same train of thought. So wanted to share that.
Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me of I often think of this. I know that you've probably heard me say this before, but in the kind of more kind of Western Christian tradition, they often talk, or they will often mention this idea of having like an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder, kind of whispering in your ear. And in a Buddhist way, I often think of it as having Mara on one shoulder and the Buddha on the other. And the Buddha is my more enlightened self that does know better. Like Maria was just saying, it's the side of me that wants to be free, that wants to be liberated and knows how to be liberated. And is like, no, don't do that. That's a trap. But Mara's sitting over on the other shoulder, like, oh, just do it. Whatever. Everybody else is doing it. Have a good time. Like, and those two voices are there. And so I totally agree with Maria in that way that there is a voice there all the time that we know all of this. And I think we really do in that way. So thanks, Maria. All right. Should we move on? Get to let's see. Well, let's start with the Bāhitika. So the piece of cloth from whence this sutra gets its name. So after Ananda teaches the king all the different ways of thinking about karma, good and bad, the king says, "Oh, it's wonderful, venerable sir. It's marvelous how well that has been expressed by the Venerable Ananda, and we are satisfied and pleased by what has been so well expressed by him. Venerable Sir, we are, we are so satisfied and pleased with what has been so well expressed by the Venerable Ananda that if the elephant treasury were allowed to him, we'd give it to him. If the horse treasury were allowed to him, we would give it to him. If we would give it, or if the boon of a village were allowed to him, we would give it to him. But we know, Venerable Sir, that those things are not allowable for the Venerable Ananda. But there's this Bāhitika of mine. There's this piece of cloth I have, Venerable Sir, which was sent to me packed in a royal umbrella case by King Ajatashatru of Magadha. It's 16 hands long and 8 hands wide. Let the Venerable Ananda accept it out of compassion. And Ananda replies, "Oh, that's not necessary, great king. My triple robe is enough." But the king insists and says, "Venerable sir, this river Achirivati has been seen by both the Venerable Ananda and by ourselves when a great cloud has rained heavily on the mountains. Then this river of Acharivati, it overflows both of its banks. So too, Venerable Sir, The Venerable Ananda can make a triple robe for himself out of this piece of cloth. And then he can share out his old triple robe among his companions in the holy life. In this way, our offering will overflow. Venerable Sir, let the Venerable Ananda accept this Bāhitika, this piece of cloth. The Venerable Ananda accepted the piece of cloth, and then King Prasanajit of Kosala said, "And now, Venerable Sir, we depart. We are busy and have much to do. You may go, great king, at your own convenience." Then King Pasanadi of Kosala, having delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Ananda's words, he rose from his seat, and after paying homage to the Venerable Ananda, keeping him on his right, he departed. Then, soon after he had left, the Venerable Ananda went to the Blessed One, and after paying homage to him, he sat down at one side, related to him his entire conversation with the king, and then presented the piece of cloth to the Blessed One. Then the Blessed One addressed all the bhikkhus, saying, "It is a gain, bhikkhus, for King Pasanadi of Kosala. It is a great gain for King Pasanadi of Kosala that he has had the opportunity of seeing and paying respect to Ananda." That's what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. All right. So the first thing we want to notice is the way the sutra kind of goes full circle. We kind of actually go all the way back to the beginning, because you might remember at the very beginning when the king, first he has to go on foot, but when he finally gets to Ananda, he says, "Hey, let's go to the riverside. Let's go to the side of the riverbank, and have a little conversation by the river." But now we know why the sutra was set at the side of the river, because at the end of the sutra, the king makes this offering and then uses this really interesting analogy. And it's this analogy of, oh, just like when the river gets too much rain, it overflows. If I give you this piece of cloth, yeah, it's going to be too much for you, but that means you can just use your old robe and share it with others. And this becomes a kind of almost a, I would call it like a Buddhist ethos. I think, I don't even know what we would call it in English in that way, but it's a very Buddhist way of thinking, this idea that if I kind of heap you with gifts, you'll overflow with gifts, and then you'll just be forced to start giving gifts to others. So the analogy of that kind of river overflowing is, you see it a lot in Buddhism in that way, to refer to a kind of what could be called like a circuit of giving in that way. So there's that, the beautiful reference to that. And then there's the actual gifting of this piece of cloth that was given to our king by the other king, King Ajatashatru. And then the last thing is what happens when Ananda goes back to the Buddha. I'm sure you caught it, but allow me to kind of accentuate it. I want you to notice that when Ananda gets back to the Buddha and he's like, "Hey, look what the king gave me. Gave me this nice piece of cloth." Notice the Buddha says, "Wow, this is a great gain for the king." Not a great gain for us. Not a great gain for you, Ananda. Like, "Ooh, you got a new robe." Or, "Ooh, we got extra cloth for robes. What a great gain for us." No, 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 no. Oh, what a great gain for the king that he was given the opportunity to give. And he did. So this, by the way, and I'm kind of glad that we have this little bit of time at the end here. So this is an idea that's another part of like the kind of the Buddhist ethic of giving. And what it is that this idea, it doesn't say it in this sutra, but it does say it in other sutras. And what it is, they talk about a punya kshetra, a field of merit. That's the language, a field of merit. And the field, the kshetra, it's the analogy is like a farmland, like a fertile field. And the idea of a field is you plant some seeds and then you get a crop. You get more than your tiny little seeds that you planted. Well, in the world of Buddhism, they have what's called a punya kshetra, a field of merit. And the idea is that a Buddhist monk or nun, a renunciant, a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni, they are considered fields of merit. And what that means is that if you give to a renunciant, if you give to a field of merit, it's basically planting merit seeds. And the idea is that a field of merit, like Ananda, a field of merit will amplify the punya. It will amplify the merit. And that's that idea that it would seem like, oh, look, it's like I'm going to give this to the monk or the nun, but really, it's not for their benefit. It's for my benefit that I have the opportunity to give in that way. So that's kind of what's kind of being referenced there at the end. And I really think that in terms of in terms of understanding this sutra in the context of the Rajavagga, so these little sutras that are all these discourses to the kings, I really think the important message is actually at the very end here. And it's this idea the that the king has had this opportunity to meet Ananda, not that Ananda had some opportunity to meet the king. And that reversal in that way, I think is really what, like, why this sutra is in this section. Because it's really talking about this like role reversal of like of putting Ananda the renunciant above the the king in that way. So, any thoughts about fields of merit or the end of the sutra? Yeah, no.
So I have two questions. First, I want to make sure I understood that the at the end of the sutra, we heard that the king was the lucky one to meet Ananda, not Ananda to meet the king, like it would be if you were a kid in England or something. But um, but are you saying that that's the message of all the king sutras? All this section is that the kings are not sort of above the medkits, or is that not what you were saying?
Um, I definitely wanted, yeah, I didn't actually finish a thought. I just kind of threw a bunch of words out. Um, I wanted to tie this in with the other sutras and notice that like so many of these sutras have been not exactly about caste or class, but very much about the. I, I started talking about this either last week or the week before. At some point, I started talking about the idea of the noble path, that we call it the Eightfold Noble Path. And the Arya idea is about nobility.
Right.
And so I think that the sutras in this section are talking about what is real nobility. And if we go all the way back actually to the very first one in this section about the pot maker, Gatikara, right? He was this lowly pot maker. But the Buddha was like, he's my number one supporter. He is the most noble,
Yeah.
even though in the caste system, he was at the bottom of the caste system. So I kind of mean it like that, Noam.
Cool. So it's redefining nobility.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a clearer, better way of saying it.
Well, no, you said it really well. My other question is about like when I saw that last line about, oh yeah, the king's the lucky one because he got to meet Ananda, I thought of it, he got the teaching, this profound teaching, right? But and I don't know if I don't want to like mince words, but like the merit you get by supporting a monk is because the monks are transmitting the Dharma, right? I mean, or am I being too transactional about it? And am I not understanding that merit in and of itself is this thing, since it's not part of my culture,
Um, it's not it's not it's not the idea of the transactionality of it. It's, I guess what it is it's it's the whole event. And what I mean is he saw Ananda, and rather than just going on with his business, he was like, "Hey, like I'm going to go talk with him." And so that was like his first step. And then he listened, and there's a way in which he could have like listened and been like, all right, I'll think about that. But no, he took the time to go see Ananda. He listened to the Dharma teaching, and then he gave Ananda a gift. And so that whole event is what we're talking about. So not just receiving or giving the gift, not just listening to the Dharma, and not just taking the time out to see Ananda, but like that whole event was a great boon for the
Mm,
king. Does that kind of like, yeah, I didn't mean to make it sound so specific that it was just about the offering,
mm,
but it was like the whole sequence of events that led him to offer. Yeah. So,
thank you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Any other comments, questions, or ideas about this lovely little sutta, Ananda Sutta, Maria?
Um, just a quickie. It seems like maybe that was Ananda's way of saying, I offer the Dharma freely, right? It's not necessary. Um,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think when he was like, "Yo, my robes are, I'm good." Like I was not teaching you the Dharma to get free clothing or whatever. Yeah, totally, totally. Ophir, did you have a question? And then Robin?
Not a question, maybe
Or
more
a
just a
comment,
comment that
please?
to some degree and that ending there that the king was able to implement the lesson to do a skillful action, right? To kind of that horse, that elephant might be unskillful here, and not giving anything might be also kind of unwholesome, but maybe a middle path here of kind of, but yeah, I think such a simple, but like what a beautiful complex. Again, the morality goes back to Angulimala and all these things that are about blame and not blame. Like there's subtle things of compassion to the journey of the sinner in a sense,
Mm.
and kind of and never really talk about sex, substances, violence, just really careful look at the skillful, not skillful, and the blameless and the outcome. So I really appreciate it. It's very, very deep.
Thank you, Ophir. I agree entirely. These little simple little, yeah, morality sutras are sometimes overlooked in that way. And by the way, Ophir, excellent insight regarding the end, that not the king got it. And so, yes, he performed a skillful action with the body that brought blissful results in that way. Sukha vipaka. Excellent, excellent. Robin, did you have a comment, question, or something?
Yes, I was going back to when one would be thinking about one's behavior. speech, body and mind. By asking the question, is it blameless? Does it not bring affliction? Would it bring blissful results? Does it, there's, of course, this is sort of relational, cultural, and it's also relational. What would be maybe permissible for one person, would be not to another person. So I'm just wondering about that path where you're trying to find, like for instance, something might cause trouble. Something that you would do would be speaking truth or something to power, and it would be like causing what would appear to be sort of trouble. So I'm just curious about that, where there just wouldn't be this one code that you're trying to find the absolute code of permissibility, but it's always sort of in relative to things.
Excellent question, Robin. That kind of leads me to want to mention something. So it leads me to want to talk about upaya, the idea of what we would call skillful means in that way. But what's interesting about that is we talk a lot about upaya in Dharma doors, and we talk about it in Buddhist studies. But interestingly, that language of skillful means, well, the skillful part of it is kusala, the language of the sutra. Upaya actually just means a means of doing something. Upaya is actually not the important word. Kusala is the important word. So it's kusala upaya. And that idea of skillful means. So now that I've mentioned that, I hear you, Robin. It's interesting, like the Buddhist ethics are very interesting in that way because of the way that these things are being measured. And I mean, like we're measuring whether something is skillful or not in terms of its afflictiveness or not, right? And indeed, that raises very interesting questions. And I have no solid answers, but what it does raise is this. So I want to think of a simple example, but an example that kind of relates to Robin's question. And what I'm thinking about is it's a situation in which what you're going to say, it might be right, it might be righteous, it might be true, it might be important, it might be all of those things. But if it's going to cause affliction to somebody, it's worth second thoughts. And in particular, I mean, I spend a lot of time doing this myself. It's part of my own personal practice. And my own personal practice is, or one aspect of my practice is, I ask myself, is what I'm about to say, do I need to say this? Or am I just saying it to, like, I don't know, be heard, or like, I don't know. And again, there's no like definitive answers here, Robin, in terms of what one, I mean, the guidance is here. We ask ourselves, is it afflictive? Is it not? Does it lead to pleasant results? Does it not? And these are the questions that we, as a kind of Buddhist practitioners, we ask ourselves. So I don't know if that helps but yeah. Oh, good. And I say that, Robin, because I really also, I wanted to circle back to what Ophir said too, about that a lot of these sutras are so refreshing because they're just talking about skillful and unskillful behavior of the body. But they don't get into sexuality. They don't get into these specifics. It's like, if that's what you're hearing, because you're dealing with either, substance issues or sex issues or these issues. So if you're hearing it, then that's sort of for you in that way. But I like that the sutra isn't specific. It's just like, no, unskillful bodily behavior that leads to affliction. So ask yourself, is what you're about to do with your body or your voice or your mind, is this going to lead to affliction for myself, others, self and others? And that other part too, asking, will this lead to more unskillfulness, or does it lead to diminished unskillfulness and more skillfulness? So, any other great comments, inquiries, insights, epiphanies, what have you? All right, then that'll do it for another sutta. And boom, we have two more, I believe. We have two more suttas in the King section. Yep, and as far as I know, we're going to do both of those, but starting with number Sutta 89 next week. So I hope you can make it. I'll be here. Thank you all for being here. Always a pleasure.